I'm Jodi Barrows with the Square and a Square technique. We recently had an email request to show more tips and hints on how we press the units and blocks. So let's get started. Okay, let's do a little quick reminder. Everything we do, we make the basic square for, and then the different ways we trim it up with the Square and a Square system, we get the different triangle units. So we need basic squares to make our quilts, our units, our blocks. We need the Square and a Square ruler, and of course I can't live without my Square and a Square technique reference book, volume 1. We'll come back to it and talk about it here shortly. But just a quick reminder of how you trim your blocks. We're going to put the tip of the 90 right into the tip or the corner of that fabric square. Your block lines go right over the seam and your grid line goes right through the point. You can see from the tip of that 90 to the edge of your ruler, that's your 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So you're going to trim just like that. And I will rotate it around, doing that to all 4 corners, and we'll get the very first option, option 1. So let's look at some of those that are already cut and talk about the different pressing of them. So here are your option 1s. And here you can see how we have put the 90 right in the tip and trimmed up, and we did that to all 4 corners. So these were just some demo squares I had left over from one of the quilt shows I went to, where we demo and then I bring them back home and use them in the videos or in actual scrappy quilts. But you can see here how we've put 2 together. And I love when you put the 2 together, you get this wonderful little unit here when you start sewing all of these together, where you'll just continue putting them together. So let's look at the back and let's look at some pressing. Okay, you have a lot of seams, and let's talk about some old pressing rules. Old pressing rules were to always press to the dark. That way that if you had pressed dark fabric to the light, then that dark would shine through. But all of our fabrics today are really a nice quality, so we don't necessarily have to worry about that. With the options, we always press so that that center square is flat and the seams go out. We always press that way on the basic square. Then when we start putting our units together, we press to what I call the least activity. Now, when you're putting the same units together, the activity, which would be the seams, that's where the activity is, they're going to be the same in every block. So you'll just have to press one going one direction and one going the other. So see how this one goes this direction. See, that seam is going that direction, and this one goes this direction. Then when you sew those together, you have one going one and one going the other. They fit nice and neat and smooth together. They call that nestle or nest the seams together. It also helps it stay where it's supposed to be, so that when you come back in here and open up and press, you have a nice sharp point. If they were both going the same direction, when you sew, it may wiggle it around a little bit to where you don't get that nice intersection on all of your different ones. Now in this one, the option 1s, of course, if you were just sewing all of these together in rows, then when you're putting 2 together, one goes one way, one goes the other, and then as you get ready to press that section, see how all of these are going one direction. And you would do that in your rows when you start building on your big quilt. Now I want to show you in the reference book here, there's a quilt called Montana Star, and it is on page 67, and it takes just these scrappy option 1s and it puts it together. It has a solid square and then an option 1, a solid square and option 1, solid square option 1, and you can see here the picture of the quilt, and it just makes a really beautiful design. And you can just go to your scrap box and just grab out your units and start making your basic squares, get them trimmed up, and then just sew them together in rows and have a beautiful quilt. It's also the one that's on the cover of the Square in a Square Volume 1 book. Okay, so let's talk about flying geese. So when you make your flying geese, of course you're going to trim 2 sides with that 1/4 of an inch. you're going to trim 2 sides with the 1/4 of an inch on the ruler, and the other 2 sides you trim sharp, and we call that the Texas 2-step. So when you trim it sharp, you're just going to put the 90 in there and then step it over 1, 2, and trim that up sharp. When you do that to 2 opposite sides and then cut it in half, you'll have your 2 perfect flying geese, just like you see here. So let's look at some ways that you can use flying geese. The most traditional one is actually called flying geese. See how all the geese are flying all one direction? And you can just turn your flying geese like this. Now notice how you can have them all one color scrappy. You can put all one color on one side and scrappy on the other. But let's think about this. If you're going to be sewing these 2 together right along here, of course you would put this up in the machine so that when you go through here you can see that nice intersection really well. But when you go to press, you would think that you would press so the nose of that flying goose is up like this, but let's look at the back what we did. We didn't do that. We pressed with it coming down. We call that breaking the beak. See how there's the beak, and see how we press this way, coming down. Now we do that for 2 reasons. One reason is because when you come back and sew here, you can see that intersection so that you can get a nice sharp point here when you're sewing. But the thing that I think is most important is that when you break the beak, it keeps the geese all going straight. Have you ever had your piece start to lean to the left or to the right? It's probably because you pressed like that. And it allows just a little bit of a rainbow curve there, and your geese can actually start going kind of crooked like that or the other direction. It's kind of like I always say in class when I'm teaching this, that is like putting a bridle in the beak, and it's making them go straight instead of start to lean to the left or the right. Also, it'll allow you to get that nice sharp point on your flying geese. Now, when you're putting nose to nose, 2 flying geese together nose to nose, if you pressed all one direction, you would have a lot of bulk or thickness on one side. So it's actually okay to press open anytime you want to distribute that fabric and ease some of that bulk in a certain area. It also allows those to come together really nice and sharp in your point, like you see here. Now in the next one, we have a star that we're putting together. So we've used our flying geese for the points of the star. See, there they are. So 2 of our basic squares gives us the 4 flying geese. So let's flip it over to the back. And notice how when we put the flying geese on the center square, see how the flying geese were flat. See how we're pressing to the least activity. There are no seams in here. It's a solid square, so there's no activity. So press to the least activity. So when we put these 3 pieces together, they went into the solid square. Now, when you sew your flying geese to your solid corners, you press so that those flying geese are flat. See how you're pressing to no activity, no seams. And look how that seam goes one direction, this one goes the other. And once again, you'll be able to nestle those seams together and be able to sew it right through nice and sharp. Now, when we press this, after we have this one sewed on, when we press, I usually press so that this is flat, this direction. And what that does is it allows these outside corners here to be seen so that when you're sewing whatever you're sewing next to the star, you can see exactly where those points are on all 4 flying geese. If we pressed to where the flying geese were going into the center, see how it would cover up that point there? And when you're sewing, you wouldn't be able to see where that was to help get that nice sharp point when you get ready to sew it to the next piece. Now in our book, we've got a couple of different flying geese ones that I want you to see. We have this one here is this star that I was showing, but instead of a solid square in the middle of it, we have an option 1. And this is on page 69 of your reference book. And when you go to the end of the pattern, you can see here how we've used an option 1 inside instead of a solid square. And you can see all of the additional sizes. If you want a 3.5, a 4, a 5, a 6, a 7, a 8, Don't forget to turn the page. And we have additional sizes here, 9, 10, 11, and 12 for that star. Also, if you want to just work on some of your flying geese, we have this great one in here called Pine Forest. So it's just using the flying geese and lining them up on top of each other to make the trees. You can make a short tree with 1 flying goose, 2 flying geese, a tall tree with 3, and so on. This is a great little pattern to work on. And since flying geese are so easy with the square and the square system, there's no reason that you can't add these beautiful trees to your different units. Now let's look when we're using them in rows or going together. Look how in this one you can do one, see how you just turn it this way, and then this way, and then this way. And you get this great effect here of these different ones coming together. And let's turn on the back. And look how we've just pressed it all going one direction. See how these seams, they're all going one direction. Now let's look at this one. This one we did with all of them headed the same direction. And so you get a little different look there if you're doing scrappy. And once again, look how we press those seams all going one direction. Now, if you wanted to use this one in a border, and say that you wanted a nice wide border, you can see how we'd have 3 rows of flying geese all going in the same direction. So when you sew these together, just like when we did on the other one, you want to break that beak. So these would be going back like that when you press to break that beak. When you have multiple flying geese going together all the same direction, remember to break the beak. Okay, let's look at some half square triangles. So here's our option 4 half square triangles. And when you make your half square triangles, you're just going to do that sharp trim, the Texas 2-step trim, on all 4 corners. So here's 4 together, all in a row for a border or maybe a block. Here's one where we've put 4 together into the pinwheel. And here's one where we've put 4 units together, but this is what we call the hourglass. See how the 2 noses of the half square triangles are coming together? Let's flip this over and look at our pressing on this one. So when you have 2 coming together, so here you can see how one seam is going one direction, one the other. See how the option is laying smooth and flat and the seam is pressed to the solid square, which is the least activity. There's no seams, no activity. So when these go together, see how these will just nestle together. And then when you press, we press these to one side, which you can certainly do that. On this one, look how we pressed it open to help distribute the seams equally on each side. And then on the half square triangles sewn together in a row, see how we press them all one direction. Going this way, you'll be able to see that point when you sew it into your next piece. And on this one, it'll be hidden. And there's just really not any way to get around that. Now the next one is just probably the most basic of pressing. And it's when you're putting strips together. So say you're doing 3 strips together like for a 9 patch, or maybe you're just putting 2 strips together. I always like to, you can press from either side when you're working with a strip, but notice how my iron is, my seam is going to go to the left. So my iron is down. Let me see if I can get this going this direction. And see how I'm using the iron to hold this one down, and see how that seam is going that direction towards the orange. So I'm going to hold it down, and I'm gently close to the seam pulling the fabric, so that just gently, firmly, so that I can get that to be a nice smooth seam. You don't want any pleats or puckers. You don't want to be able to pull that apart and see that, oops, you've got some of that pressed wrong. So when you go back, I always press from the front first. Always go from the front first because you can see if you're getting the fabric pulled apart well enough for a press. And anytime you're sewing 3 strips together, always press the first 2, then come in and sew the other side on. Don't ever sew 3 together and then go to the iron to try to press, especially if your strips are smaller than the 2 inches. There's just not enough room in there. And part of the reason why these don't turn out the size that you want them to be, like for 9 patches, or you struggle with it being skinny here and wider here and skinny here and wider here, is because you didn't press when there were 2 together. It'll be much neater and more accurate if you'll press 2. Then sew the other strip on and press. So see how we have that white one is going to be flat. So if you're pressing from the back, you can't always tell if these are pulled apart well enough. So always start from the front. And this one I already pressed when there were 2. And see how I'm just gently, and I want that seam to go out or away, and I'm just gently pulling close down. Never pull on the edges of your fabric. I always go close to the seam and just gently but firmly tug or pull on that just a little bit so that you can get a nice clean press and no pleats and no puckers. And your 9 patches will lay much smoother and be much more accurate if you'll sew 2 together and press before you put the 3rd one on. So a little bit of tips and hints on how to press your work. Hopefully this has helped. Anytime you have any questions with the Square and a Square system, just email us and we'll make a video for you. Remember to subscribe and thumbs up. Thanks for watching.